Oh, I didn't have to ask for permission that time.
Oh, nice.
All right. You ready?
Do it.
All right. Welcome to Essential Coaching Conversations with Kyle and Asim.
The real, relevant, necessary conversations to help you navigate coaching, teaching, learning, and life.
Coaches, welcome in Season 2, Episode 30 of Essential Coaches. I don't even know the name of our podcast.
Been a
Essential
while.
Coaching Conversations. And as you can see from the title, we have one of our favorite, and when we say our favorite, it's the sort of sarcasm, like tongue-in-cheek favorite Coachspeak phrase of brutal honesty. We'll get to that in a minute. But we are, and this is shout out to our guy Adrian Mills. We'd been looking for a name for this segment. We got a few suggestions, and he just said something about making it about heating the cheese. And as you know, you can go back and listen to our previous episode about heating the cheese and what that means. I think, Kyle, you and I are going to take it upon ourselves then to heat the cheese by bringing some good news, some shout outs, whatever it is here at the top of the episode. Because I think, when in the pre-show, which the pre-show, for those keeping score at home, the pre-show today lasted an hour and 20 minutes because we have not had a chance to catch up. And that's generally what we do during that time, is just catch up on life and talk and all of those things. But, I think it's become harder and harder to find good news and to find levels of positivity that we can discuss on the pod and bring to people and, generally just feel good about ourselves. So I think that's a great name for this segment. Not that the news necessarily or the thing that we saw that we really loved heated the cheese for someone, but we are going to attempt to heat the cheese for you, the listener, to start to feel good about the world a little bit. Kyle, would you like me to go first or would you like to go first?
I would love for you to go first.
All right, fantastic. So I had to look this up. I found like a positive news site, and I did check the links. This is not a fake story, but there in Japan, there's been some research that fungi, is it fungi or fungi? What would you say as a
I,
science
I
teacher?
I say fungi, but that also lends to some really great dad jokes
Because I'm a pretty fun guy.
when you're teaching seventh grade. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go with fungi. Fungi can form connections, and it is they have neural networks within different groups of fungi, and the researchers put them in different shapes. So they put the spores in a circle, and they put the spores in an X, and they were able to communicate across each other to know that, like, for example, one side of the circle would not try to spread across the circle, but rather they would move in the circle. And they came to the conclusion that the only way that one spore on one side knew from the other side was through those networks across the circle, not to go across where there's no spores to connect to, but to actually go around and keep the circle. And same thing with the X, that they were able to just like communicate with each other. And so to me, it made me think about like that every living thing needs some sort of connection. And in an increasingly disconnected world, like we're obviously like connected digitally and whatever, but like human beings, living beings need some level of connection. And so, like, for what it's worth, those fungi, like for them, the fungi component is undefeated. Same thing for us, right? Like the human component is undefeated. But it also made me think, and in far like darker terms, of have you ever seen the show The Last of Us?
I actually have seen some of it.
Or
Yeah.
did you play the video game?
I've never played the video
So
game.
the video game's outstanding, right? And the whole point is that there becomes this like horde of zombies that spreads through fungus spores. And so that also is what it made me think of, that like they can communicate with each other so they know, hey, let's go infect the entire population and we're all going to make zombies and then the last of us comes to life. I don't think that's going to happen. Knock on wood. I hope that doesn't happen. But it was a really cool story just to see like that there is this connection happening between something that we look at as sort of like maybe a pest in your lawn, right? Like you have lawn fungus or you have mushrooms growing or whatever. And there's, you can look it up like with the mats that are 9,000 acres large, if that's like one mushroom spore or one fungus spore that just continues to grow and grow and grow and grow, and it can interact with its environment and stuff like that. I just thought that was pretty cool. And something that is relatively positive, right? Because I think that there's like benefits to using fungus in technology. So they've also been able to make like biodegradable computer chips using fungus, which we would never know. And I would know nothing about that unless I looked it up. So I'm glad I did. But over to you. What is your heat? How are you going to heat the cheese today?
Well, first off, I appreciate the biology segment. I don't get
I
to
do what
talk
I
about
can for you.
biology anymore. Nobody cares about me talking biology at this stage in my life. So it's nice to talk about a couple of fun guys. I will admit, going through this, and this was part of our pre-show, as I was like rearranging my setup here. That honestly, like, I had a hard time really thinking about this because I've been so consumed by work. And so a lot of, I was trying to think of something outside of work, but work has pretty much been all consuming. And some of that has been by design. I've somewhat been intentional with shutting the rest of the world out lately, just because there's not a lot of great things going on, and trying to stay focused on work and more at home and controlling what I can control and all that kind of stuff. But so somewhat of it, some of that is somewhat self-inflicted. I haven't sat down and watched a single, college football game or anything like that yet. Just haven't really had the time, nor have really wanted to uh, so far. But I have I have been able to run into just organically in the last couple of weeks, maybe 6 or 7 former students of mine that are now like 25 years old, which is hard to believe. Some from Cedar Creek, some from Simsboro. Actually ran into one at work the other day, who's working at the school, in the physical plant, and keeping the school churning. And to me, it was just really neat to bump into these former students who still call me Coach K. They've still got a memory about class, you remember that time when kind of thing. And they'll reminisce on some of that kind of stuff. And it's just neat to see them doing well. They're not a seam from 10th grade class anymore. Like, they're a seam who's a working professional, right? And it's neat to see the fruits of some of that labor from those years ago. And we oftentimes talk about how, we're planting these seeds and it's bamboo and it won't grow for 10 or 15 years. But after you've been doing this for a while, you eventually, 10 to 15 years later, you're in this long enough, you start to see some of that fruit. Um, some of those rewards. And it's neat knowing that, like, every time I go out into town, I might bump into a former student and get to hear how they're doing. And one of them's a former player who's still playing collegiate basketball, and I'm going to get to watch them play soon. And just kind of hearing how they're doing and hearing how well they're doing, and knowing that they eventually grew up, and even if they were a little bit of a headache in class at some point, that they're a working adult and they're a professional and they're getting married and they're having kids and they've got a job. And I think that's kind of what we all hope, that any former student of ours is going to be able to grow up and be a productive member of society. That's what we want. And so it's just kind of interesting that in the last 2 to 3 weeks I've bumped into several of those students, whether it be at like a store or out grabbing a bite to eat, or even bumping into them at work because we're working at the same place. And I've even got a guy that I taught in my first year whose kid goes to school with Kindle, which is really hard to believe. A couple of years younger, not same class, but like bumped into him at Carline. And that was really cool, but also really stung.
I felt that for you. Like as soon
Yeah.
as you said his kid, I felt something here in my chest that I was like, yeah, that like hurts a little bit, man.
Yeah, but like we're getting to that point where that's
Yeah,
a thing now, right? And I mean, I've got kids. I say I've got kids who are on their second or third kid, that are teaching at the
sure.
school that I taught them at, and so life goes on, but it's just, I don't know, it was neat, not necessarily like one particular thing, but it was just neat to see the growth, the maturity, the success that former students and former players have. And I think it's a nice moment to kind of recenter yourself, if especially if you are still out there in the trenches teaching every day, coaching every day. Um, that eventually that 10 or 15 years is going to come. And whatever you're doing in that particular day in class, even if it's just down to being the one teacher that greets them at the door, daps them
Hmm.
up, and asks them how their day is going, I can unequivocally tell you that 15 years later, they will remember that and it will make an impact on them. And so this is a little bit of retroactively heating the cheese from 10 to 12 years ago of, hey, I'm really glad that I was that person for them, or I had people that mentored me into becoming that particular teacher or coach for them. And just knowing that, yes, it is a grind, it is a long haul. um, it takes a minute in order for you to kind of see the fruits of that labor, but it does eventually come. So that was the best thing that I have seen over these past couple of weeks, was getting a chance to run into some former students and just being able to catch up with them and knowing that they're doing well, and that they've got fond memories of school, they've got fond memories of class, and no, it was never what we didn't talk about the objective on the board. We didn't talk about standardized testing. We didn't talk about all the things that we're told is important, but there were certain things that we did in class that stuck with them even till this day, into their early, mid, or maybe even late 20s at this point. Um, so that would be mine.
Yeah, man. Like and shout out, like you said, to all the people who are still in the trenches. Like I think that payoff, it's such delayed gratification, right? Of like, did I or did I not make an impact on these people? And then when you tell a story like that right there, it's not just heating the cheese for the listener. That's how you heated the cheese for those kids,
Hmm.
right? Because it could. I often think about like, what's a decision that you or I or anybody who taught made that may have been maybe a breaking point or a continuing point for a kid, right? And like, I would like to think more often than not, we did make the next best decision for them. And I think when you have moments like that, it certainly lends itself to the fact that that might be true.
Hmm.
Um, and that they do feel good about the relationships that you guys had. And even if they didn't, right, they see it now as an adult and they're like, he was probably doing what was best for me and for the class at the time. And like, I actually did appreciate being in his class. Um, I think there's a lot of tropes too of like, there was that one teacher you always hated, no matter what, you would never talk to them again. And it's like, no, if you saw that person in the grocery store, you'd probably say hello.
Hmm.
Right? Like, no matter how much you quote hated them, none of them did anything to you that was like horribly wrong. Within reason, right? But like, I do think that more often than not, we do make that impact. And now you're starting to see that because you still live in the community in which you taught. My I don't live in those communities anymore. Like I never really lived in the community, but it's funny like seeing some of my former students getting their first jobs on
Hmm.
LinkedIn. And I'm like, oh my God, like what? You were a sophomore, and then I realize it's been what, since I first started at Woodson, it was 2015. So it's been almost 10 years, right? So my sophomores then are now 3 years out of college. And so I think that's really cool for you to get to have those experiences. And I'm sure you're going to have more as you continue to live where you live and work where you work. I'm sure you're going to see hordes of your former students being successful adults and just being successful in life.
Yeah, and it was a nice kind of reminder too, like even in a completely different line of work now, as to like, okay, there will be a 10 years later now. So like you still have the opportunity to do that, whether you're teaching, coaching, not. That was, and I've talked about this on the pod before, and to several people personally, like getting out of teaching, you think you're going to miss out on the opportunity of having an impact on people. And it's like, oh, I've always wanted to work with kids and impact, young people and youth and all this and that. And you go work with adults and you think, oh, I'm not going to impact adults. And it's like, no, adults need impacting too.
Oh
Like
yeah, they
adults
definitely
need
do.
coaching too. Like we all do. And so that's been really kind of the most eye-opening thing for me over the last 3 years is working with collegiate athletes and then working with adults is that that opportunity is still there. And so, and as a supervisor and running departments and, hiring young people who are 22 to 28 years old and getting their first jobs and becoming professionals is like, there's a massive opportunity there to impact them and knowing, okay, this is like their first real work life, real world experience that they're getting. I'm setting them up, for their next job or their next boss or something like that. And there's definitely still incredible amounts of opportunity to connect and, you know, um, be able to be that person for them now that in 10 years, when they're 33, 34, I might have a chance to bump in them somewhere else and be like, man, you remember when I first got to Louisiana Tech and I was just young and dumb and didn't know what I was doing? Man, I really appreciated, what you did for me here or the opportunity or teaching me or, hey, when I screwed up, you had the opportunity to pull me in and tell me something. And so I think like for those that are still out there teaching, coaching in the trenches, like, keep doing what you're doing because it will eventually pay off. But even for those of us that might not be in the trenches in that particular context, we're still in the trenches wherever we are, right? And I
Right.
think it's still a great reminder that again, there's an opportunity to impact people all around us, and had a chance to have a conversation with one of our head coaches and some of our athletes yesterday, just kind of informally over some coffee and talking about some leadership in life and what they have an opportunity to do to impact their teammates. And you just sort of remember like, man, this I might not be their head coach. I might not be their seventh grade science teacher, but there is still an opportunity in front of us to impact any of those around us, regardless of title, regardless of how well I know you or anything like that. So it was a really great reminder of those things. And again, it gets me more excited to know that every time I go out of the house, I might run into somebody else, right? And so I'm excited to continue to try to make those connections and connect with older kids. And I mean, a couple of them they're getting into med school, and I taught these kids AHEC, 10 years ago. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, great. I didn't ruin the medical industry for you, And then I'm reminded that I taught AHEC however many years ago. And it feels like 3 lifetimes ago. But it's just neat to see that opportunity is out there. And again, like I think it's a great reminder for all of us that every single day that opportunity is in front of us.
Well, that's leadership, right? It's leadership is influence, and you have the ability to influence wherever you are and whatever you're doing, right? And I think that regardless of whether it's adults, whether it's kids, whether it's in a classroom, it's law enforcement, it's waste management, being an athletic trainer, working from home, being in customer support, being customer success, like running your own thing, being a playmakers operator, right? You have all of these touch points with people. And so I think if thinking even back to this fungus example, right? Are you going to be the one that doesn't influence the growth of your fungus, or are you going to be the one that says like, hey, that's not the right path to go across, let's go around and let's work together to build what we need to build? And so I think in that way, you're doing some really, really good things. And I commend all of those that are still in it, and fighting the good fight to continue to do that, but not to be gaslit into the idea of like, hey, remember your why is like the reason why you can't put food on your table too, right? Like I think two things can be true at the same time, where like, yes, you do make that impact, but also like remembering your why is not enough compensation for the impact that you make. um and I think that's a little bit, as a great segue, a little bit of brutal honesty for the administrators who listen. And so we say that tongue in cheek. This is something that you and I have talked about on the podcast before. We've certainly talked about it in our EC cohorts before, about the idea that like brutal honesty is such a shitty phrase to begin with. And this was brought back to the light. And I know we mention Ed Silva all the time on the pod, and we are going to get him on. We're just sorting out availability, but he texted a group chat the other day and essentially said, like, you know, why is honesty, why does that need to be brutal, and like why can't we have compassion or, you know, empathy and things like that? Like, why is it brutal honesty and that's the go-to of how we deliver feedback? And so I don't think this necessarily is going to be a long pod episode, but I'm hopeful that it's impactful just from the standpoint of, like, you and I think are in complete alignment, as is 98, 99% of our EC fam that we've talked to about this. Like, brutal honesty is bullshit. And there's nothing that should be brutal about communication or communicating or connecting with somebody else. To me, that's complete, absolute, like, abdication of responsibility, especially when it comes within the power dynamic of the coach to the player, the supervisor to the employee, whatever it is. Brutal honesty to me is a substitute for effective communication in a tough situation. And I put tough, like tough in quotation marks, because, like, what is really a tough situation when you're talking about putting a ball through a hoop, like kicking a ball into a goal, stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like, I think brutal honesty is a complete lack of perspective. And I'll throw it to you for your opening thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think 30,000 foot view, brutal honesty. Usually, first off, it's only those who are able to do that in a position of power. Brutal honesty is never allowed to be brutally honest from down up. It's not like it's this 360-degree feedback kind of thing. And it's typically used in a situation where, again, it's from a position of power, and when the brutal honest statement is over, there is no ability to allow for a rebuttal. It's typically just this one-way piece of communication. It's not a back and forth. And then what I've kind of noticed just over the years is when people are like, "Oh, well, I'm brutally honest," or I say what I think, and then I let it go. Well, you're completely invalidating the person who is receiving said honesty. And just because you feel a certain way about it, it's not like you're allowed to accept that brutal honesty back. Um, and I think a lot of times it's not even so much like the content of what is being said. There are definitely times where people have to be told things they don't want to hear, and we have to say things that we might not necessarily want to say, but it's for the good. And I think a lot of times brutal honesty gets lost in not the content, but the method in which it's done. And I can deliver a brutal truth in a not so brutal way and still deliver the message in a way that might be a little bit more empathetic and impactful, and again, opening up the ability to kind of ask a question coming back my way to help smooth out some of that. Like, a lot of times, to me, brutal honesty is like, oh, I'm telling them the tough things. You're telling them the tough things in an easy way because you're not opening up the ability for there to be back and forth. I can say whatever I want to and slam the door in your face and walk away and not have to think about it. That's a much easier thing. And I think in a lot of ways, brutal honesty is sort of the softer way of going about things. The tough way to go about things is to open up the line of communication, to think about how to deliver that message, to know who it is that you're talking about and deliver it in a way that is going to be more impactful in a positive way, and then allow that question to come back to you and be in a position of not just understanding, but a place of security in your own self, that you feel good in the message that you're delivering. And I'm okay if you need to ask me a question back, because I'm going to be able to answer that question. And I think a lot of times when you hear that term brutal honesty, it's just, I'm going to give you some bad news in a bad way in the easiest, most convenient way for me possible. And then that's end of discussion. Like, that's it. I get to close the door and I get to walk away, which again, in a lot of ways to me is an extremely soft way of, that's not a very brave thing to do. is to just tell somebody something they don't want to hear and then get to opt out of the rest of the conversation and leave them alone. And again, it's typically going to come from top down. There's no student who's allowed to be brutally honest with their teacher, um, and and get away with that. It's just
Right.
it's not something that you're going to see.
Well, and so I wrote down a couple of things that we'll get to in a second, but one of the things that reminded me of is like sort of the double speak that coaches tend to do, by saying, and you and I have been very clear on this as well, that we don't believe that like workplaces and teams are families, right? A workplace is a workplace and a team is a team. Like we are not a family, because I don't love you unconditionally. I love my wife unconditionally. You love your wife and your daughter unconditionally. You all are a family. We are a family. I mean, like I like the people I work with, but I wouldn't jump in front of a car for them, right? Like I love the people I worked with at Worcester Academy, but like they were my coworkers, and like I loved my kids, but they weren't my kids. They were their parents' kids. They just lent them to us for the purposes of education and basketball, right? It doesn't mean you don't have an emotional connection, but to say that it's a family is very like off-putting to me. Now, with all that said, if you were to treat your team like your family, all right? So I'm posing this to you and to all the coaches listening. If you really if you really treated your team or your players like your family, would you not deliver the remarks you needed to deliver in a way that helped your family stay like intact and able to function and not cripple them for at least the time being?
Yes,
Like when
100%.
you're going to like discipline Kendall, right? I'm not trying to get in the weeds with how you guys operate at home, but like from a general sense, if Kendall were to do something wrong, or like let's say you had a bad day and you needed to be brutally honest about something, you still got to wake up and see that person the next day, and they rely on you for everything. So in what way can we say, and I say we as general statement of coaches and teachers and whatever, like how can we say that we are a family, and when we're in the recruiting process, like, oh, it feels like a family here, but in no way, shape, or form would you ever treat your family that way?
Yeah, I think that's what I meant. You more elegantly, man, said that the way that is kind of like I get to opt out of the rest of the
Right.
conversation. But at home, we still got to wake up together
Right.
and eat breakfast together and drive to school together. Like there is no opting out of the family, right?
Right.
And that's where like if I get to walk in and just bulldoze you with this brutal honesty, it's me basically throwing a grenade and turning around and walking away, and then telling you that you've got to be okay with what you heard, and you got to be okay with everything that is sort of impacted from the fallout of said truth. And again, there is no dialogue here. But there's not going to be this back and forth. And again, we're generalizing. Like maybe somebody out
Mm-hmm.
there does allow for some back and forth and so on and so forth. But typically, when you're hearing this, especially in a teacher to student or a coach to player, type of setting, I'm going to call you into the office. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stuff that you don't want to hear, and I'm not going to offer you any opportunity to explain yourself or give you any resolution or chance to fix said things. I just get the opportunity to be brutally honest and yell at you. And when we were texting about this the other day, you said something that I would like for you to kind of expand on a little bit is why do we only ever talk about brutality when it comes to the honesty part? Why do we never talk about brutal connection, brutal trust, right? Brutal honesty needs to be preceded by brutal trust. And we never talk about creating the conditions to deliver said brutal honesty in a way that is not perceived as brutal. So a lot of times when I think you're hearing this term, it's not even so much what you're saying, but it's how it's being received. And the deeper and the better relationship that I have with the person that I'm communicating with, I can deliver really bad news in a
Mm-hmm.
way, or really constructive criticism or something that's going to make them better in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're this big or a piece of shit.
So I just got to rearrange my screen here so I can see you and this. So I looked up, okay, because I think this is actually happens a lot in our society, and it's happened, I think, probably over the the last 10 years. Maybe I've just become more aware of it over the last 10 years. And it's sort of like what happens in the book 1984, or even in Fahrenheit 451, Lord of the Flies. Like, we start to diminish the meaning of words, right? And so they take on a connotation that's different from their denotation. And so I looked up, just dictionary.com, anybody can look it up. What is the actual definition of the word brutal? All right. And I want to see if these are things, this definition, because then I'll go through and answer what you asked. If this should ever be applied to something anyway, just hear me out. Brutal is an adjective. The first definition is savage, cruel, or inhuman. Synonyms are barbarous, brutish, and ferocious. And the antonym is kind. Shall I continue? Second definition, crude or coarse. Synonyms being uncivil, rough, rude, or gross. Third definition, harsh or ferocious. And this is where underneath in italics, when it's giving an example, it says brutal criticism, brutal weather. All right. Fourth definition, taxing, demanding, or exhausting. Fifth definition, irrational or unreasoning. Sixth definition, of or relating to lower animals. And under antonyms, human. So coaches who say, when they are in the recruiting process, and recruits, I need you to hear me on this. Not my recruits, I'm not even recruiting anymore, but young people and families, I need you to hear us on this. This should be a red flag if coaches say during the recruiting process, I am brutally honest with my players. That means, by definition, they are savage, cruel, and inhuman, crude and coarse, harsh, ferocious, taxing, demanding, or exhausting, irrational and unreasoning, and relating to lower animals. So I say all that to say this. I don't know if brutal is the right word for the rest of the stuff that we want to be. Right? We can't be we can't have like brutal levels of trust, right? Like a savage level of trust. I don't even know what that would look like. We got to think of a different word. Maybe the antonym here being human, we can have a human level of trust. We can have a human level of empathy. We can level with each other and say, listen, I don't like what happened. But the way that I'm going to deliver this message, whatever it is, whether it's one-on-one, coach to a group, teacher to a group, friend to friend, colleague to colleague, whatever it is, I am going to deliver this in a kind way, in a way that is humanizing, in a way that does not dehumanize you and treat you like an animal. Now I'm going to tell you what, if I have to correct my dog, you think I'm going to yell at her and snap at her and tell her she's the worst? Nope. Is a simple no. And then when she does the right thing, what happens? She gets pats and she gets scratches and she's told she's a good girl. Right? I'm not saying that we're gonna say that to humans, but think about it. Like, that is a lower animal, right? Like, that's not a human. We would treat them with kindness. And it's sort of like a mark of like being a sociopath when you treat animals poorly. But here in the same vein, you're going to go and treat your 18 to 22-year-old, 14 to 18-year-old players that way? For what reason? To show that you are better than them, that you are smarter than them, that they're not doing what you want, so you have to yell at them? and then you say, well, this hurts me more than it hurts you. To me, like, that is a level of abuse that just to say, like, I'm brutally honest makes no sense, right? Because then you're admitting to being savage, cruel, and inhuman to get a point across. And it's a level of communication that I think actually demonstrates, like you said, it was soft. Like, I think it demonstrates a lack of intelligence. That's my opinion on that. And so when you ask, like, why do we only talk about brutality and honesty? I think it really is like, it's some of that piece of being soft, some of the lack of intelligence, but I also think it's like Kip would say, it's a lack of emotional agility, right? The ability to get past the hurdle of how you feel about it, to communicate it in an effective way that seeks a resolution. Very often, this whole idea of brutal honesty doesn't lead to a resolution. The resolution is you feel better now that you got it off your chest. But what about the recipient of that message? They probably feel like shit. And we know through copious amounts of studies that have been done on this and human behavior that people react poorly to that, number one, but that their results go down on whatever the next thing is they have to do. So I do think there needs to be a shift in this idea that, like, honesty can, the only thing that can be brutal is honesty. Like, sure, but then you're just kind of being an asshole, right? You're being uncivil. It's rough. I'm just reading these synonyms for it, right? It's rude. It's gross. Like, do you feel good, Kyle? Like, think back to when you were a young coach and you delivered a brutally honest message to your team. Did it make you feel good to do that?
I'm sure it did in the moment.
Sure. In the moment, yeah. But then we would turn right around and say, what? That this generation can't. Yeah, they're the microwave generation, right? Yeah. They want instant gratification. But by being brutally honest, isn't that what you're seeking, is instant gratification?
Mm-hmm. You're trying to immediately manipulate a behavior.
Sure.
And a lot of times when you think about, like, well, what do I want out of this brutal honesty? What am I trying to do? This person is making my life more difficult as the teacher in the classroom or whatever. And I really just need you to be more compliant, right? So it's not about changing or working on the values of who this person is as a human being. Are they really falling in line with the standards of our program or working their way up to the line or whatever analogy you want to use? It's really just, hey, I need you to be more compliant because you're making my life more difficult. And I think we've stumbled on another instance here of telling on yourself. If the only way you know how to deliver news is through brutal honesty, what you're doing is telling on yourself. And what you're saying is, I don't have the tact to come up with another way to do this. And I don't have the emotional agility to actually engage in a conversation with somebody and allow for some back and forth and allow them to ask questions and enter into a little bit of just candor and have an organic, authentic conversation. Because the more brutally honest I can be, the quicker I can, again, throw the grenade in the room and shut the door and I walk away. I don't have to live with the fallout of that. But in a family, we are all going to wake up together the next day and have to see each other across the breakfast table. Or we're going to have to come home after a long, hard day's work and sit across the dinner table and have a conversation with somebody. And the more brutal honesty that you go through, the more reps you go through, I think that also creates more and more of a chasm between the two people that are communicating. And eventually you get to where that brutal honesty is met with deaf ears. I'm eventually just going to tune you out because I know what's coming. And it's a lot easier for me, the recipient, just to nod, say yes, sir, say yes, ma'am, and know that I can get out of there a lot quicker. And every year, it's football season, here comes the clip of Sean Lee and the two Dallas Cowboy linebackers who are sitting on the bench getting their asses absolutely reamed by their coach. And everybody's like, see, that's what being a pro is. They're sitting there, eye contact, active listening, nodding their heads, all the while, your junior high girls volleyball team are not professional football players, first off.
Right.
And likely those guys are just going, yep, Coach Rostogie's on one again. Just nod, say yes, sir. He'll eventually tire out and he'll go away. And then we'll go on doing what we're doing. But nothing actually changes. The behavior doesn't get corrected. We're not actually improving or getting on with that. And I think I don't think we've talked about this on the pod, but we got a chance to do some work at Tech with John Gordon,
Yeah,
his
yeah,
guy,
yeah.
Chad, Power of Positive Leadership. And one of the lessons or bits of that book talks about love and accountability. And I'm like, love versus accountability, and asking you, like, on this spectrum of love and accountability, where would you fall? And most people go stand on, one end or the other, some are in the middle. And it's like, it doesn't need to be this love versus accountability. Love and accountability really are the same things. If I truly love you, I'm going to hold you accountable. And I'm going to hold you truly accountable because I love you. And if I didn't, I wouldn't. I wouldn't care what you were doing. And I think this brutal honesty, there's a part of this conversation in this love and accountability sector. If I don't truly love you and don't care if I hold you accountable, that I can be brutally honest with you because I don't really care what happens to you. It's really more about me than it is about you. And I don't think, or where we've gotten to this point, but having some tact, being kind, having some civility to you when you have a conversation with somebody, that doesn't weaken the message. That doesn't change the message. And so, on the flip side of that, being brutally honest, being savage, being all of the things that you said there, that also doesn't make the message better, right?
Oh, it makes it worse.
So being kind and civil does not diminish it, but also being brutal, that doesn't necessarily strengthen it. And I think if you can utilize, if there's a chance to grow when it comes time to have a conversation like this with somebody, and that's not to say that we're never going to deliver news that we don't want to, or have to deliver bad news, or have to correct somebody in a way. And maybe it's an awkward conversation or one of these quote unquote tough conversations that we all say we're okay with having. Those things have to happen. But can we take a tough conversation and make it not so tough in
Right.
how we go about that? Like, can we show off our ability to be emotionally agile and get out of a tough conversation by not making it quite so tough and softening that in a way? And then knowing that the next time we have to have this conversation, it's not quite so bad. It's not
Mhm.
quite so tough because we've deepened that conversation, or sorry, we've deepened that connection and relationship by having a more emotionally agile conversation. Because likely that tough, that brutal honesty, what you notice is that that's not the only conversation that ever happens. We have to keep coming back to that well. And every time, the level of that brutality or savagery has to increase because
So
you become numb to it, I think.
so let me ask you this, because I was wondering as you're talking about how like the repeated conversation might have to happen. Is the entire point of this brutal honesty thing, is the entire point permanent behavior modification due to fear of having to have that conversation again?
You're just hoping that you scare them so bad that they will fix it.
Yeah, like the fear coming from the receiving party or parties, right? They feel this certain sense of dread. Like if I do that again, I'm going to get yelled at and they're going to be brutally honest with me or whatever. So I'm just going to avoid doing that altogether. Is that the goal?
I would think so, and in some instances that might work. You create more compliance, and there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with a certain level of compliance. It certainly can help, but and if that's what you're going after, then okay, great. But the problem is that none of us are saying that's what we want when we're getting these
Right.
head coaching jobs, when we're teaching. We say we're doing this because we want to work on a more transformational, impactful level. But then we go about doing things that work in the inverse of that. And so if you truly want to be this transformational leader, then like that's not the way to go about it. If your job is literally just to make sure we hit the number of widgets on the production floor every single day for the bottom line, and it is straight up this transaction of input versus output, then sure, like this can get you maybe the desired outcome. And you might run through employees over and over and over again, and you can replace them a little bit more easily. But that's only going to work for so long. And then again, for like the audience, I think we're trying to reach, coaches, teachers, leaders, administration, so on and so forth. None of us have ever said that's who we want to be.
Right.
It's
Right.
all about being better, going deeper, being further, but yet our words and our actions don't typically align with the mission statement that's on the locker room wall, or the header that's on the rule book that we pass out, the
Mhm.
one team meeting that we have throughout the year, or whatever the principal is going to tell the faculty, the one staff meeting we have before the kids come back. And we say all of these kinds of things. And then, of course, as we get busier throughout the year and our tolerance gets worn down and we're tired and we're stressed and we're sick and we're caught up with the entropy of the day and everything else, it becomes just a little bit easier to be brutally honest for 2 seconds and hope that you're going to change that behavior. But again, like, behavior modification can work to a certain degree, but that doesn't impact or change that person for the better.
Right.
I'm just going to show up and sign in on time to avoid the punishment. I'm not actively trying to seek good decisions.
Sure.
I'm just trying to avoid the negative.
Mhm.
And if we're going to truly try to heat the cheese or be above the line, or again, whatever analogy you use with your teams, you don't want people who are just merely avoiding the negative. You want them actively seeking the positive, and then not just actively seeking the positive for themselves, but impacting those around them
Mhm.
who are seeking the positive as well. And again, I think the brutal honesty thing, like you said, we're telling on ourselves a lack of intelligence, more emotional rigidity, not emotional
Yeah,
agility, is you're just
absolutely.
saying, like, I'm not going to go down that road because I either don't care, I don't have the time, or I'm not equipped with the skills to do it.
I think I'd like to coin a phrase of emotional elasticity.
I'm writing
Right.
it down.
Write it down. Let's see if we can put a trademark on that. Emotional elasticity. Um, and the reason that came to mind, like, I think agility is like emotional agility. Obviously, we agree with that. It makes sense. But I think when I think of agility, it's sort of like getting around things, right? And it's like moving through the obstacles. Whereas the emotional elasticity is like you can stretch yourself in different ways to achieve what it needs to be achieved within whatever you're trying to do. And so to be inelastic means you refuse to change. No matter how much you're stretched, you refuse to change. You're going to do it one way and that's it. To be elastic, you change based on the demands of whatever it is you need to get done. And I think the idea of certain players, for example, stretching you in certain ways, certain parents stretching you in certain ways, to be elastic within that, but still maintain your shape, that I think is reminiscent to me of what we had always asked our administrators as coaches to do, which is just to have a fucking backbone. Pardon my French, but like, that's what we needed them to do. But without emotional elasticity, they couldn't do that. And they were more being agile to the point of like just jumping through hoops to make sure that the other party was satisfied, and then being brutally honest with us and saying, hey, your services are no longer required. Right. But if we all demonstrate, if all parties demonstrated a little bit of that emotional elasticity, how much better off would we be in those conversations? Right. I remember a specific incident that happened this last go around where parents got on Zoom. My AD was on the Zoom too, and they were cussing me up and down. And there was nothing. There was nothing. They were being brutally honest. I'm pretty sure they even said that during the meeting. And you just had to sit there and take it. And then you got to go coach their kid that day and you got to deal with your AD. There's a far better way to do that. But I think it's a complete lack of self-regulation, right? That whole frontal lobe thing that deals with decision making, like, severe issue. that then compounds itself to where, and I'd written this down earlier, like I don't remember where I heard this or in what context I heard it, but I think it was something to do with like conflict resolution and some of the facilitation work that I do. Like, are we being, when we enter a conversation? So I'll give you two examples, and let's maybe talk through these. The first example is like you have to call, a team meeting or a player meeting about something that went wrong, and you're going to be brutally honest with them, right? And the other one is just that practice. Something's not going right, and players pissing you off or whatever it is. In either of those situations, how do you approach that to know that at the end of the conversation, all parties want a resolution in mind, right? So you want to end the conversation with a resolution. How do you create that environment, that climate, to where brutal honesty isn't even on the table? Because every conversation we have, we want a resolution that we have agreed upon ahead of time.
How do you do that? It's not by being brutally honest. I know how not to do it. It's hard. And I think that's kind of the point to this, is like one is a little bit more of the easier opt-out route versus the I'm in it for the long haul. And again, like going back to the family analogy, like family is not conditional, it's not temporary, it's permanent, it's forever, it's long lasting, it's everything, right? And you don't get the ability to sort of be agile enough to just get out of the room. And so thinking about your elasticity word, like elasticity is not just being able to bend around an issue. It comes back to center. It's getting back to your normal shape. It's getting back to you, your standard, your framework, your core value. At agility, you can go bounce all over the place, but you never may get back to where you may be so agile you're on the other end of the world, and you sort of lose sight of where you were. And so I think the elasticity word plays really well here, just sort of fleshing this out, because ideally we have a center, we have core values, we have pillars, we have this identity of who we want to be. And we might need to be able to bend around some things or get to a certain, because we're being either squeezed, we're being compressed, or we're being stretched to our limits. But after that, we're going to return back to our center. We're going to return back to our normal. And I think there's a nice distinction between those two. And I use this. I remember debating this a long time ago when I was writing my standards and rule books and stuff. Like even the difference between perseverance and resilience. Like I used to talk about my teams wanting to persevere all the time, and we were not good. We got punched in the face a lot. And to the kids' credit, like we persevered. Like we got back up every time we got knocked down. But to me, resilience is punching back. It's not just being able to take the hit and then stand back up and be ready to get punched in the face again. It's getting punched in the face, getting back up, and then having a little elasticity to myself to be able to actually punch back. And to me, I think the resilience and the elasticity have a lot in common here, that it's not about just getting by and surviving. It's not survival of the fittest. We're thriving here. It's not survive and advanced, it's thrive and advanced. And you can only be so agile and so brutally honest and so this and this for so long. Eventually, you're going to agile yourself off the road and not be able to find your way back home. But the elasticity piece, the resilience piece, the tact, the kindness piece, it allows us to get back on the road and find where we're going, and get back to our core, our center, our North Star, our vision, our mission, all these things, again, that we say to get these jobs. But then we get in them and crap starts to hit the fan so bad that we're just in sink or swim mode and we're just trying to keep our head above water. And you and I talk all the time about what it felt like to teach and what it feels like to be in the middle of that grind all the time and this wearing you down to a nub. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way all the time. We can get to a point where it is not survive in advance and it's not just dodging bullets and it's not just getting hit and being able to get back up. It's us actively seeking solutions and actively trying to win and thriving over surviving and being resilient, not just persevering, not ignoring the negative or running away from what is bad, but seeking out and actively running towards what is good. And if we can get to a place where we set the brutal honesty aside and we emphasize and we prop up connection, communication, respect, and trust, the honesty is going to naturally fall into place.